Back in this country, a lot of debate right now because of this huge overhang over the White House. What do you do about the Bush tax cuts? Keep them, roll them back? The president, as you know, wants to extend them for the middle class, but get rid of them for the highest earners. Our next guest says if Congress lets all these tax cuts expire, we could see a huge drag on GDP in the first half of next year. Alec Phillips is a vice president at Goldman Sachs, and he leads the firm's policy research efforts. Alec, the debate seems to be do we, don't we, but the reality is we're running against the clock here. The decision may be made for us.
Yeah, there's a good deal of uncertainty right now in terms of what happens. There was not much expectation that they would actually get this done ahead of the election, but now we're essentially looking at a period of 3 or 4 weeks following the election where Congress needs to decide not only what happens with the expiring tax cuts, but also what happens with expiring unemployment benefits and some of the other expiring stimulus-related provisions. If they do extend it, obviously we're talking about more or less keeping the status quo in place. If they don't, we could have a pretty significant drag on the economy, at least in the first part of next year.
So this is an issue that may be decided, before we get the new blood in there, unfortunately. But talk to me about whether you believe, and you're advising clients to plan for higher taxes or not.
Well, it sort of depends on which people you're talking about. I think there's generally very broad agreement that we'll get an extension one way or another of tax cuts for what most people are calling the middle class. Really, the question is more about a smaller segment of tax cuts for those in the upper income brackets. The way President Obama defines that is $250,000 or more. Frankly, I think there are a lot of people in Congress who are starting to look at that threshold as maybe, $500,000 or more,
really?
Perhaps even $1 million or more.
Yeah, well, obviously, there are people in this country who'd say, the cost of living diverges so greatly from, New York City to the middle of the country. What constitutes high income? Why 500,000 as the key level?
Well, I think, what it's going to come down to is a legislative debate where the initial proposal may start out at $250,000, but that may not get enough support in a lame duck session of Congress. If it doesn't, they will probably end up increasing that threshold. Perhaps it's $500,000, perhaps it's more, to the point where they actually get enough Republican support in a lame duck session to get it through. If that doesn't happen, then what you could end up seeing is an extension of essentially all of the tax cuts for 1 year. That's certainly something that Republicans would like to see. I think, frankly, an increasing number of Democrats are becoming, potentially in favor of something along those lines as well, at least as a stopgap mechanism.
And, have you run the numbers on that in terms of impact on growth?
Well, the interesting thing is it's actually less dependent on what happens with the upper income tax cuts, and it's more dependent on what happens with unemployment benefits, as well as something known as the Making Work Pay Credit, which is a tax credit in place in 2009 and 10 as a result of the stimulus package passed last year. If you look at those two things together, you're talking about essentially $125 billion or so in 2011. That's a lot more than the $30 to $40 billion a year that we're talking about in terms of the upper income tax cuts. And so, when we look at the fiscal drag that could result from an expiration of all of these provisions, it's actually probably more important what they do on some of the other things than it is on the upper income tax cuts themselves.
So what happens with those $75 billion in benefits? Do they get handled separately? Do they get bundled in?
If they do it in a lame duck session of Congress, I think what we're actually looking at is essentially one big package that deals with unemployment benefits, as well as the expiring tax cuts. Our own estimates assume that we get a Making Work Pay Credit extension, that unemployment benefits expire. Frankly, I think we're starting to see it move a little bit in the other direction. But honestly, at this point, we can't really make any firm predictions until we know what the election results are themselves.
Well, we will stay tuned for that, and really interesting to hear that what defines upper income may be up for debate. We'll keep track of that.